In the mountain town of Copper Ridge, where war widows outnumbered, married women 3-1, a quiet bartender made a choice that scandalized the entire community. They whispered that Frank Mercer had lost his mind when he offered marriage to the one-armed beggar woman at his saloon door. But none of them knew what he saw in her eyes that autumn morning, or that his decision would lead to a moment where he'd face the same fate, losing his arm to save the son she thought she'd already lost. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn of 1869 painted Copper Ridge, Colorado in shades of gold and crimson, the aspens turning the mountainsides into living tapestries that seemed almost too beautiful for a world still scarred by war. The town itself sat nestled in a valley where Silver Creek cut through the landscape, its waters running, clear and cold, from the peaks above. 4 years had passed since Appomattox, but the war's fingerprints remained visible everywhere in the disproportionate number of women wearing black, in the missing limbs and haunted eyes of men who'd made it home, in the children who'd never known their fathers. Frank Mercer wiped down the mahogany bar of the Golden Horn Saloon with the same measured strokes he'd used every morning for the past 3 years. The wood had developed a particular sheen under his care, reflecting the early light that slanted through the tall windows facing Main Street. He was a man of medium height and build, with brown hair that was beginning to show threads of grey at the temples despite his 32 years. His hands were steady and capable, his movements economical, his presence somehow both unremarkable and quietly reassuring. "You're polishing a hole in that bar, Frank," Margaret Crawford observed from her usual spot at the corner table where she conducted the Saloon's business. At 56, Maggie was as much an institution in Copper Ridge as the mountains themselves. She'd bought the Golden Horn with money saved from 20 years of working in her father's trading post, and she ran it with an iron will wrapped in velvet courtesy. "Wood this find deserves proper care, Miss Maggie," Frank replied, without looking up. "Your father knew what he was doing when he brought this bar up from Denver." Maggie's eyes softened at the mention of her late father. "That he did, though I suspect you'd make a pine plank shine like mahogany if you set your mind to it." The morning light grew stronger, illuminating the saloon's interior. Unlike the rough establishments common in mining towns, the Golden Horn maintained an air of respectability that made it acceptable for women to visit in the afternoons and for the town council to hold occasional meetings in its back room. Oil paintings, real ones, brought from St. Louis, adorned the walls between mounted elk heads. The piano in the corner was kept meticulously tuned. Even the spittoons were polished brass rather than battered tin. The front door opened, admitting Dr. William Hayes, along with a gust of cool morning air. The physician looked as though he'd aged a decade in the 4 years since the war's end, his hair gone completely white and deep lines carved around his eyes and mouth. But his hands remained steady as a surgeon's should, and his dedication to Copper Ridge's citizens had never wavered. "Coffee, Frank." Black and strong enough to strip paint, Frank already had the pot in hand, pouring into the heavy ceramic mug he kept specifically for the doctor's morning visits. "Rough night?" "The Morrison baby. Breech birth." Hayes wrapped both hands around the mug as if drawing warmth from it, though the saloon wasn't particularly cold. Mother and child both made it, thank God, but it was touch and go for a while. "Catherine Morrison?" Maggie looked up from her ledger. "That's good news." With her husband still laid up from that mining accident, she needed something to go right. Hayes nodded, sipping his coffee. "Towns full of women raising children alone. At least Catherine has a husband, even if he can't work right now. So many others." He trailed off, the sentence completing itself in the silence. Frank knew what the doctor meant. Copper Ridge had sent 47 men to war. 23 had returned. Of those 23, 5 were missing limbs, 7 carried wounds that would trouble them for the rest of their lives, and all bore invisible scars that manifested in nightmares, sudden rages, or the kind of distance that made their eyes look past, rather than at the people who loved them. The saloon began to fill with its morning regulars. Thomas Brennan, the hardware store owner, arrived precisely at 7:30 as he did every day, ordering his usual whiskey with breakfast. Samuel Chen, who ran the laundry with his wife and sister, stopped in for the hot tea that Frank had learned to prepare to his exacting standards. Martha Dennison, the schoolteacher, appeared at 8 to collect the newspapers that arrived on yesterday's stage and were kept at the Golden Horn for the town's literate citizens. "Morning, Miss Martha," Frank greeted her, already pulling the bundle of papers from beneath the bar. "Good morning, Frank, Dr. Hayes." Martha accepted the newspapers with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She'd lost her fiancé at Gettysburg and wore her grief like a well-tailored dress, perfectly fitted but impossible to remove. "Anything interesting from the outside world?" "Haven't looked yet, but the stage driver mentioned something about railroad expansion." Frank set a cup of tea before her, prepared exactly as she preferred. "Seems they're surveying routes through the territory. Progress marches on," Hayes murmured, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely pleased by the prospect. "Though I wonder if Copper Ridge is ready for that kind of change." The conversation drifted into comfortable patterns, discussions of weather, mining yields, the upcoming harvest festival, the new Reverend's surprisingly progressive sermons. Frank moved through it all with the ease of long practice, refilling cups, offering quiet observations, remembering preferences. He knew that Thomas Brennan's whiskey habit had worsened since his son died of pneumonia last winter. He knew that Samuel Chen was saving every penny to bring his parents over from California. He knew that Martha Dennison sometimes stayed later than necessary, simply to avoid returning to an empty house. What people didn't know about Frank Mercer could fill volumes. They didn't know that before the war he'd been studying law at a small college in Pennsylvania. They didn't know that he'd served as a quartermaster sergeant, keeping supplies flowing to Grant's army, a position that required mathematical precision and the ability to make impossible logistics work. They didn't know that he'd chosen Copper Ridge specifically because it was far from Philadelphia, far from the life and the fiancée he'd left behind when he returned from the war and found her married to his younger brother. The morning wore into the afternoon. The saloon's character shifted with the changing light and clientele. Miners came in dusty from early shifts, washing away rock dust with beer and conversation. The town's few merchants took their midday breaks at Maggie's tables, conducting informal business over sandwiches prepared by Mei Chen and delivered from the restaurant 2 doors down. Frank moved through it all like a conductor leading an orchestra, anticipating needs, smoothing conflicts, maintaining the delicate social ecosystem that made the Golden Horn more than just a place to drink. "Frank, could you run these accounts to the bank?" Maggie asked around 2 o'clock, handing him a leather portfolio. "My hip's acting up, and those stairs are murder. Today." "Of course, Miss Maggie." Frank unteed his apron, hanging it on its customary hook. "Anything else you need while I'm out? Pick up my order from the mercantile if it's ready. And maybe check with Edward about whether he's received that shipment of French wine I ordered." The October afternoon was crisp and bright. The sky, that particular shade of blue that seemed to exist only at altitude. Frank made his way down Main Street, nodding to familiar faces, pausing to help Mrs. Patterson maneuver her baby carriage over a rough patch of boardwalk. The town had settled into its afternoon rhythm, steady, predictable, peaceful, in a way that still felt somewhat miraculous to those who remembered the war years. Copper Ridge had been fortunate during the conflict. Its copper mines, while profitable, hadn't been essential enough to warrant protection or attack. The war had remained a distant thunder, known primarily through letters from the front and the gradually lengthening list of men who wouldn't return. The town's wounds were personal rather than structural, written in individual griefs rather than burned buildings or shattered economies. The bank occupied a solid brick building that spoke to the town's growing prosperity. Inside, Frank found Jonathan Reeves, the banker, reviewing documents with his characteristic meticulous attention. "Afternoon, Frank. Maggie's accounts? And her eternal hope that you'll find some error that makes her richer than she realized." Reeves chuckled. "Been keeping her books for 8 years now. Woman runs a tighter operation than most corporations I've dealt with." He accepted the portfolio, flipping through its contents. "Everything appears in order, as usual. Tell her the deposit will be processed by the end of business today." Frank completed his other errands with the same steady efficiency. At the mercantile, he collected Maggie's order fabric for new curtains, a case of lamp oil, various sundries. At the freight office, he confirmed that the wine shipment was expected on next Tuesday's stage. At the post office, he picked up the Saloon's mail and his own single letter, which he recognized immediately as being from his mother in Philadelphia. He didn't open the letter. He never did, not right away. Instead, he tucked it into his jacket pocket and made his way back toward the Golden Horn, his arms full of packages. The afternoon shadows were lengthening, painting the street in alternating bands of gold and shade. In a few hours, the saloon would fill with the evening crowd, louder, rougher than the morning and afternoon clientele, but still manageable. Copper Ridge wasn't a lawless frontier town. It had a sheriff, a mayor, a town council, churches, and a shared understanding about acceptable behavior. Frank had just passed the alley between Morrison's feed store and the surveyor's office when he heard it. A sound so soft he almost missed it beneath the general noise of the street. A whimper, quickly, suppressed, followed by a child's voice trying to sound brave. "It's okay, Mama. We can try the church. Reverend Collins always has soup on Wednesdays." Frank stopped. The voice came from deep in the alley, where afternoon shadows gathered thickest. He set down Maggie's packages carefully, making sure they were stable, and stepped into the dimness. What he saw would change everything, though in that moment he couldn't have known it. A woman sat against the alley wall, her dress threadbare and patched, her dark hair hanging loose around a face that might have been beautiful if it weren't hollowed by hunger and hardship. But it was her arm, or rather her missing arm, that struck him first. The left sleeve of her dress hung empty, pinned up at the shoulder, in a way that suggested the amputation had been recent enough that she hadn't yet had time to properly alter her clothing. Beside her stood a boy of perhaps 8 years, thin as a rail fence, with his mother's dark hair and eyes, that had seen too much for his age. The child's hand rested protectively on his mother's shoulder, and Frank recognized in that gesture the terrible inversion that occurred when children felt compelled to parent their parents. "I'm sorry," the woman said immediately upon seeing Frank, her voice hoarse, but educated. This was no frontier roughness, but the diction of someone who'd once lived very differently. "We weren't stealing. We were just resting before moving on." Frank held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I wasn't going to accuse you of anything. Are you hurt? Do you need the doctor?" "We're fine." She struggled to rise, using only her right arm for leverage, and Frank saw how difficult the simple act had become. The boy tried to help, but he had so little strength to offer. "We were just leaving." But Frank had seen what they were trying to hide, a bundle of rags that, upon closer inspection, contained a smaller child, no more than 3 years old, burning, with fever and shivering despite the afternoon warmth. "That child needs a doctor," Frank said quietly. "How long has she been sick?" "He," the woman corrected automatically. "Thomas. His name is Thomas, and his brother is James." Her voice broke slightly on the names, as if saying them aloud made their situation more real. "It's just a cold. He'll be fine once we find somewhere warm to stay. Dr. Hayes is at the Golden Horn." Frank made the decision without conscious thought, acting on instinct that hadn't steered him wrong in 3 years of tending bar. "It's just up the street. Let me help you. We have no money." The woman's pride fought with desperation in her voice. "I can't pay a doctor. I can't pay anyone." "Then it's fortunate that Dr. Hayes typically treats first and discusses payment later." Frank moved closer, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. "I'm Frank Mercer. I work at the Golden Horn. Miss Maggie, who owns it, has never turned away a sick child, and she won't start today." The woman studied him with eyes that had learned to weigh men's intentions, to measure the distance between stated charity and hidden prices. Whatever she saw in Frank's face must have satisfied some internal calculation, because she finally nodded. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Caroline Fletcher. "And these are my sons, James and Thomas." Frank helped her to her feet, noting how light she was, how her dress hung loose on a frame that had recently carried more weight. He gathered the feverish child carefully, shocked by the heat radiating from the small body. James, the older boy, collected their few possessions: a carpet bag that looked as worn as their clothing, a thin blanket, a small wooden horse that had been carved with love, if not skill. The walk back to the Golden Horn took only minutes but felt longer. Frank was aware of the stares, the whispers that followed their unlikely procession. Caroline Fletcher walked with her head high despite everything, refusing to show shame even as her situation proclaimed itself in every threadbare inch of her clothing, in the pinned sleeve that advertised her disability, in the sick child that marked her as desperate. The saloon fell silent when they entered. Frank saw the scene through his patron's eyes: a stranger woman, clearly destitute, missing an arm, carrying a sick child. In any frontier town, this would be cause for concern, suspicion, or pity. Copper Ridge, for all its growing civilization, was no exception. "Dr. Hayes," Frank called out, his voice calm but urgent. "I need you." The physician rose immediately, his medical training overriding any questions he might have had. He took one look at the child in Frank's arms and pointed to the back room. "In there. Maggie, I'll need hot water, clean cloths, and whiskey the good Irish, not the rot gut." What followed was an hour of tense activity conducted in relative quiet. Dr. Hayes examined young Thomas Fletcher with thorough care, asking questions of Caroline in a gentle voice that helped her relax enough to answer fully. The boy had pneumonia, advanced enough to be dangerous, but caught perhaps just in time. The fever needed to be brought down, fluids needed to be forced, medicine needed to be administered. Through it all, James Fletcher stood sentinel by the door, watching everything with those two old eyes, ready to defend his mother and brother from any threat. Frank brought him a plate of food, bread and cheese and cold chicken from the saloon's kitchen, and watched the boy's internal struggle between hunger and pride. "Your brother needs your mother's full attention right now," Frank said quietly, crouching to the boy's level. "Best way you can help is to keep your strength up. Can't take care of anyone if you're too weak to stand." It was the right argument. James accepted the plate and ate with the desperate efficiency of someone who'd gone too long between meals but had learned to hide it. Between bites, he answered Frank's careful questions. They'd come from Kansas. Father died at Shiloh. Mother lost her arm when a wagon overturned during a storm 18 months ago, pinning her beneath it. They'd tried to make it work on their father's farm, but one-armed women couldn't manage the heavy labor required, and the bank had foreclosed. They'd been heading west, hoping to reach California where Caroline had a sister, but their money had run out in Denver. They'd walked most of the way to Copper Ridge, hitching occasional rides on freight wagons, sleeping rough, living on charity that grew thinner the worse they looked. By the time James finished his story, Frank's jaw was tight with an anger he hadn't felt in years. Not at the boy or his mother, but at a world that could grind people down so thoroughly, that could take a woman who'd already sacrificed her husband to war and demand her arm as well, that could reduce an educated woman and her children to begging in alleys. Dr. Hayes emerged from the back room, wiping his hands on a cloth. His expression was carefully neutral in the way that doctors learned when delivering news that could break either way. The boy needs rest, warmth, proper food, and medicine. 3, maybe 4 days before we'll know if he'll pull through. But he's young, and he was strong before this recent hardship. If we can keep the fever down and get nutrients into him, he has a fighting chance. We'll need to find them somewhere to stay, Maggie said, her practical mind already working through logistics. The boarding house has a room, but Martha charges 50 cents a night, and they'll need... They can stay in my room, Frank heard himself say. I'll sleep in the Saloon's storeroom. It won't be the first time. Every eye turned to him. In the silence that followed, Frank felt the weight of a decision that he didn't fully understand himself. He only knew that some things were right, that some people needed help, and that he was in a position to provide it. Frank, Maggie said carefully, that's generous, but perhaps we should consider my room has a real bed, a stove, and a window that latches properly. The storeroom has a cot and extra blankets. Seems straightforward to me. Dr. Hayes studied him with an expression that might have been approval. The boy shouldn't be moved far in his condition. Your room would work well, provided Mrs. Fletcher is comfortable with the arrangement. Caroline had emerged from the back room, looking even more exhausted than before. She'd heard the entire exchange, and now she faced Frank with an expression that mixed gratitude, suspicion, and desperate calculation. Why? Why? She asked simply. Why would you do this for strangers? Frank considered the question, aware that everyone was waiting for his answer. He thought about his mother's letters, still unread in his pocket. He thought about his own flight from Philadelphia, from a life that had crumbled in ways that left no visible scars. He thought about the past 3 years in Copper Ridge, tending bar and listening to stories, learning that everyone carried burdens invisible to casual observation. Because someone helped me once when I needed it, he finally said, which was true, even if incomplete. And because, in Copper Ridge, we take care of our own. But we're not your own. We're nobody to you. Not yet, Frank replied quietly. But given time, that can change. The news spread through Copper Ridge faster than wildfire through dry timber. By the time Frank carried young Thomas upstairs to his room above the saloon, half the town knew that the bartender had taken in a destitute widow and her children. By sunset, the other half knew too, along with embellishments that transformed the simple act of charity into something far more scandalous. I heard she's a confidence woman from Denver, Mrs. Adelaide Thornton announced to her quilting circle the following morning, probably scouting the town for her gang to rob. I heard she lost that arm in a knife fight, countered her sister-in-law Elizabeth. Criminal element, mark my words. At the hardware store, speculation took a different turn. Fletcher, you said? Thomas Brennan mused, measuring out nails for a customer. Had a Colonel Fletcher in the Kansas regiment. Died at Shiloh. Wonder if there's a connection. The barber shop, that traditional clearinghouse for male gossip, offered its own theories. Mercer's always been a soft touch, opined Henry Walsh, between razor strokes. Remember how he helped the Johansson family after their barn burned? Man's got a savior complex. But it was at the church social on Thursday evening that the whispers crystallized into something more pointed. Reverend Marcus Collins, young and earnest in his ministry, found himself fielding questions that had little to do with Scripture. It's inappropriate, sniffed Lydia Morrison, whose husband ironically owed his life to Dr. Hayes's skill. A single man housing a woman, not his wife? What kind of example does that set? The kind where sick children receive care and the desperate find shelter, Martha Dennison replied coolly. The schoolteacher's defense of Frank surprised some, but those who knew her well understood. She recognized in Caroline Fletcher something of herself, a woman remade by loss, trying to survive in a world that had specific, narrow expectations of widows. Up in Frank's former room, Caroline Fletcher sat vigil by her youngest son's bedside, unaware of the storm brewing in the town below. Thomas's fever had broken on the second day, thanks to Dr. Hayes's medicines and Caroline's relentless care. The boy was weak but conscious, able to sip broth and whisper requests for his brother. James had claimed a corner of the room for himself, sleeping on a pallet of blankets that Frank had provided. The older boy remained wary, watching every interaction with protective intensity. When Maggie brought up meals, James positioned himself between his mother and the door. When Dr. Hayes came for his twice-daily examinations, the boy's hand always drifted to the small knife he kept in his boot. "Your brother's going to pull through," Hayes told Caroline on the third morning, satisfaction evident in his voice. "Another week of rest and proper food, and he'll be running circles around you." "Thank you, Doctor." Caroline's gratitude was genuine, but her eyes held worry that went beyond her son's immediate health. "I know you said we could discuss payment later, but I need you to understand I have nothing. Not money, not jewelry, nothing to trade or barter. I can't repay what you've done." Hayes packed his instruments with deliberate care. "Mrs. Fletcher, I learned during the war that some debts aren't meant to be repaid in currency. Keep that boy healthy. Raise both your sons to be decent men. That's enough payment." After the doctor left, Caroline allowed herself a moment of weakness, her shoulders shaking with silent tears. James was beside her instantly, his thin arms wrapping around her in fierce protection. "We'll be okay, Mama. We always figure it out." "I know, sweet boy. I know." But Caroline's voice held doubt that her son was too young to fully understand. They'd been living on the knife's edge for so long that even temporary safety felt like a trap waiting to spring. Downstairs, Frank was learning exactly how complicated simple charity could become. The morning crowd at the Golden Horn was smaller than usual, and those who did come maintained a careful distance. Thomas Brennan, usually quick with friendly conversation, kept his greetings formal. Samuel Chen avoided eye contact entirely. Even Maggie moved through her work with an unusual quietness. It was Martha Dennison who finally broke the tension. She arrived mid-morning, school lessons concluded for the day, and settled at the bar with her customary tea. "You've got the town talking," she said without preamble. "I've noticed." Frank's hands continued their automatic work, polishing glasses that were already clean. "Didn't realize kindness was controversial." "It's not kindness, Frank. It's the propriety, or rather, the perceived lack of it." Martha sipped her tea, studying him over the rim. "A single man housing a woman alone. You've given the gossips ammunition. The woman has 2 children and was sleeping in an alley. What exactly did people expect me to do? Something that wouldn't challenge their narrow sense of decency." Martha's smile was wry. "You should know by now that frontier morality is a peculiar beast. We'll tolerate claim jumping, card cheating, and the occasional gunfight, but suggest any impropriety regarding women and suddenly everyone's a Boston Brahmin." Maggie joined them, her expression troubled. "Martha's right, Frank. I've had 3 different women corner me at the Mercantile this morning, asking pointed questions about the situation upstairs. Mrs. Thornton even had the nerve to suggest I should exercise more careful supervision of my establishment's reputation. Adelaide Thornton's been trying to shut down this saloon since before I started working." "Here," Frank replied, though he couldn't keep the edge from his voice. "She'd find fault with charity to orphans. Perhaps, but she's not wrong that this situation is unusual." Maggie hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Frank, I'm not questioning your motives. God knows you're one of the most decent men I've ever met. But you need to understand how this looks to people who don't know you as well as I do." Before Frank could respond, the door opened to admit Sheriff Porter Grimsby. a bear of a man whose gentle demeanor belied his intimidating size. He'd lost an eye at Antietam, and the leather patch he wore gave him a piratical appearance that children found either terrifying or fascinating depending on their temperament. Frank, Maggie, Miss Martha. Grimsby nodded to each in turn. Mind if I have a word, Frank? Private-like? They moved to a corner table, away from the handful of patrons who were making no secret of their interest. Grimsby waited until Frank had brought him coffee before speaking. Got a delegation of concerned citizens planning to visit me this afternoon. Seems there's worries about the Fletcher woman and her boys. What kind of worries? Frank's voice remained level, but his grip tightened on his glass. The usual small-minded variety. Questions about her character, her intentions, whether she might be running some kind of scheme. Grimsby sighed heavily. For what it's worth, I think it's all horseshit. Woman's obviously had a run of bad luck, and you're doing the Christian thing by helping. But I've got a job to do, which means I need to ask questions. Ask them. You know anything about her beyond what she's told you? Anyone who can vouch for her character? Any proof she is who she says she is? Frank considered lying, but he and Grimsby had developed a mutual respect over the past 3 years. No, I know what her son told me, that their father died at Shiloh, that they lost their farm, that they've been traveling west. Beyond that, I've taken them at their word. That word might not be enough for some folks. Grimsby drank his coffee, studying Frank over the rim. Look, I'm not saying don't help them, but maybe it'd be wise to get Mrs. Fletcher situated somewhere else once the boy's well enough to move. Boarding house, maybe. Something that doesn't fuel the gossip fires. With what money, Porter? She's got nothing. Church has a charity fund. Or several families might be willing to take them in, split the burden. Grimsby set down his cup. I'm trying to help here, Frank. This situation's got complications you might not be seeing. After the sheriff left, Frank stood behind his bar and felt the weight of Copper Ridge's judgment settling on his shoulders. He'd thought helping the Fletchers would be straightforward, provide temporary shelter, allow the boy to heal, help them on their way. He hadn't anticipated becoming the subject of town speculation, hadn't considered how his actions might appear to those who measured morality in rigid increments. That evening, after the saloon closed and Maggie had retired to her own quarters, Frank climbed the stairs to check on his unexpected guests. He knocked softly, identifying himself before Caroline bid him enter. The room looked different with occupation. Caroline had made efforts to tidy and organize, despite her limited ability. James's few possessions were neatly arranged in his corner. Thomas, still weak but clearly recovering, was propped against pillows, looking at a book that Martha had brought by earlier, Mr. Mercer. Caroline rose from her chair, awkwardness evident in her posture. Is something wrong? No. I just wanted to see how Thomas was progressing. Frank kept his distance, aware suddenly of the impropriety that everyone else had already noted. The room felt smaller with her in it, more intimate. He's much better. Dr. Hayes says another few days of rest and he can start moving around more. Caroline's hand, singular, twisted in her skirt. I've been wanting to speak with you about arrangements. Arrangements. We can't stay here indefinitely. You've been extraordinarily kind, but I'm not blind to reality. I heard the church bells this morning, saw the women gathering afterward. I know how this looks. She took a breath. As soon as Thomas can travel, we'll move on. Perhaps the church can help us with supplies for the journey to California. Frank found himself moving closer, without conscious decision. And if I said you don't have to leave, then I'd say you're not thinking clearly. Caroline's voice was gentle but firm. You've already given us more than we had any right to expect. But this town is talking, Mr. Mercer, and talk like that can destroy reputations. I won't be responsible for damaging yours. My reputation can survive some gossip. Can it? Caroline's dark eyes searched his face. "I've learned something in the past 18 months, Mr. Mercer. People who've never faced true hardship are quick to judge those who have. They'll look at you harboring a woman like me and draw the worst conclusions. They'll paint you as either a fool or a lesher, and they'll paint me as either a con artist or something worse." James, silent in his corner, spoke up suddenly. "She's right. We've seen it before. In Kansas, when Mama first lost her arm, people treated her different, like she was damaged goods, not worth common courtesy. Then, when we started asking for help, they treated her worse. Called her names, said she should put us in an orphanage and go work in—" He stopped, abruptly, young enough to know he shouldn't finish that sentence. Frank felt something hard and cold settle in his chest. "Work where, James? It doesn't matter." Caroline's voice was sharp. "We're leaving as soon as possible. That's final." But Frank had seen enough of human nature in 3 years of tending bar to fill in the blanks. He'd seen how frontier towns treated desperate women, the narrow options available to those without resources or male protection. The anger he'd felt learning their story returned, hotter and more focused. "Mrs. Fletcher Caroline, may I be direct?" She nodded warily. "I don't give a damn what the gossips say. I've heard Adelaide Thornton's opinions on everything from temperance to women's suffrage, and I've learned to weight them accordingly. The same goes for anyone else who measures their Christianity by how quickly they can judge others." He paused, gathering thoughts he hadn't fully formed until this moment. "You need time. Time for Thomas to fully recover. Time to earn some money for your journey. Time to plan your next steps properly, instead of desperately. We don't have the luxury of time, Mr. Mercer." "Frank, and yes, you do, because I'm offering it." He saw her opening her mouth to protest and pressed forward. "I've spoken with Maggie. Starting tomorrow, if you're willing, you can work in the saloon. Nothing inappropriate, helping with inventory, mending linens, perhaps some cooking. Maggie's hands aren't what they used to be, and she could use assistance. You'd earn wages. Not much, but enough to save for California." Caroline stared at him as if he'd suggested something impossible. "I have one arm, Mr. Mercer. I'm not exactly an ideal employee. You have one arm, a sharp mind, and an obvious education that makes me wonder what your life was before it all went wrong." Frank's voice softened. "I've seen you reading to Thomas. That's not common schooling in your inflection. You write a fine hand, based on the note you left thanking Dr. Hayes, and unless I miss my guess, you've managed household accounts and inventories before." "Aye," Caroline faltered, and for the first time Frank saw her composure crack completely. "How did you know?" "Because I recognize someone who came from somewhere else, someone who's learned to hide their past." Frank smiled slightly. "Takes one to know one, Mrs. Fletcher." The silence that followed held weight, two people recognizing in each other the markers of lives interrupted, of falls from different graces. James watched them both with confused fascination, too young to fully understand the undercurrents, but old enough to sense their importance. "Why?" Caroline finally asked the same question she'd posed when they first met, but now with different shading. "Why risk your reputation, your position, your peace for people you don't know?" Frank thought about Philadelphia, about a life that had seemed so certain until it wasn't. He thought about the past 3 years in Copper Ridge, building a quiet existence that was comfortable but incomplete. He thought about his mother's unopened letters and the questions they represented about duty versus desire, obligation versus authentic choice. "Because maybe," he said slowly, "helping you helps me remember who I wanted to be before life taught me to be careful." The words hung in the air between them, honest in a way that surprised them both. Outside, Copper Ridge settled into its evening rhythms, lamps being lit, families gathering for supper, the comfortable sounds of a town at peace with itself. But in that small room above the Golden Horn, something had shifted, some possibility had opened that hadn't existed before. "1 month," Caroline said finally. I'll work for Maggie for 1 month, save everything I can, and then we'll reassess. But Mr. Mayor Frank, if this becomes too difficult, if the gossip becomes too damaging, you must promise to tell me. I won't destroy your life to save my own." "Agreed." Frank extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Caroline took it with her remaining one. Her grip was firm, corlused from recent hardship, warm with life despite everything she'd endured. As Frank descended the stairs back to the saloon's main floor, he was aware that he'd just committed himself to a course whose end he couldn't see. He'd defended Caroline Fletcher to the sheriff, offered her employment that would keep her in Copper Ridge, inserted himself into her story in ways that couldn't be easily undone. The storeroom where he now slept was dark and quiet, but Frank found himself wide awake, staring at shadows on the ceiling and wondering if he'd just made the wisest or most foolish decision of his careful, measured life. Upstairs, Caroline Fletcher lay in the darkness beside her sleeping sons and allowed herself, for the first time in 18 months, to imagine that survival might be possible, that perhaps the long fall might have finally reached bottom and the only direction left was up. Neither of them could have known that the town's judgment was only beginning, or that the real test of Frank's commitment was still to come. Caroline Fletcher's first day working at the Golden Horn began before sunrise. She descended the stairs to find Frank already brewing coffee, the saloon's interior lit by a handful of oil lamps that cast warm pools of light against the pre-dawn darkness. "Didn't expect you so early," Frank said, surprise evident in his voice. "Farm habits die hard. Besides, Thomas woke up just after 4, and once I'm awake, there's no point lying still." Caroline accepted the coffee he offered, cradling the cup in her right hand with the ease of long practice. "Where would you like me to start?" What followed was a partnership that surprised them both with its efficiency. Caroline's claim about managing household accounts proved conservative. She had a head for numbers that rivaled Maggie's own, spotting discrepancies in supply orders that had gone unnoticed for months. Her one-handedness, which she'd feared would prove limiting, became merely a practical consideration requiring creative solutions. She couldn't carry heavy trays, but she could organize inventory with ruthless precision. She couldn't pour drinks with Frank's two-handed speed, but she could prep garnishes, manage ledgers, and coordinate supply deliveries with an efficiency that freed both Frank and Maggie for other tasks. "Where did you learn bookkeeping?" Maggie asked on the third day, reviewing Caroline's meticulous reorganization of the saloon's accounts. "My father ran a textile mill in Massachusetts. He believed daughters should understand business as thoroughly as sons." Caroline's voice held the careful neutrality of someone discussing a past that no longer existed. He was unusual in that regard. "Massachusetts," Maggie's eyes sharpened with understanding. "Long way from Kansas." "Yes, long way indeed." The town's reaction to Caroline's employment proved exactly as contentious as expected. Adelaide Thornton led a delegation to the saloon on the 4th day, her considerable bosom heaving with righteous indignation. "Margaret Crawford, this is beyond the pale. Employing that woman, putting her on display for every man who walks through these doors. Mrs. Fletcher works in the back office and the kitchen," Maggie interrupted coolly. "She's seen by fewer people than my own cook. Unless you're suggesting I dismiss employees based on their physical disabilities? Should I fire old Pete because he lost his leg at Chancellorsville? That's different, and you know it. Pete is a man, and he lost his leg honorably in service to his country. This woman lost her arm in an accident," Martha Dennison cut in. The schoolteacher had made a point of taking her afternoon tea at the Golden Horn every day since Caroline started working. "Or are you suggesting there's a hierarchy of acceptable mutilations, Adelaide? Perhaps we should post a list so the rest of us know which missing limbs qualify for Christian charity." The confrontation ended with Adelaide's retreat, but the damage was done. Lines were being drawn in Copper Ridge, invisible but real. There were those who found Frank and Maggie's actions commendable, and those who saw them as dangerously subversive to proper social order. The town's careful post-war equilibrium was disrupting. James Fletcher adapted to life above the saloon with the resilience of youth, though his protective vigilance never wavered. He appointed himself his mother's shadow, walking her to and from work in the early mornings and late evenings, positioning himself in the kitchen where he could watch both his recovering brother and his working mother. Frank, recognizing the boy's need to contribute, found tasks for him: sweeping floors, stacking firewood, running errands that earned him small coins. He immediately turned over to Caroline. "You should keep some for yourself," Frank told him after one such delivery. "Buy something you want. Don't want nothing except to get to California," James replied, his yaw set in a way that reminded Frank painfully of Caroline's own stubborn pride. Thomas recovered with the impressive speed of childhood, graduating from bed rest to short walks, then to playing quiet games in the upstairs room. Dr. Hayes pronounced him fully out of danger on the 10th day, though he cautioned continued rest and proper nutrition. "Your mother saved your life," Hayes told the boy during his final examination. That and Frank Mercer's decision to help when he could have walked past. "Mama says Mr. Frank is a good man," Thomas said seriously. "She says we should remember that good men are rare and precious." The doctor's eyes found Frank's across the room. "Your mother is a wise woman." It was on the 15th day of Caroline's employment that everything accelerated toward inevitable collision. Frank had closed the saloon and was conducting his nightly inventory when he heard raised voices from the alley behind the building. He recognized James's voice immediately, tight with fear and defiance. The scene, Frank discovered, made his blood run cold. 3 miners regulars at the saloon, but never trouble before, had cornered James. They reeked of whiskey from cheaper establishments, their faces flushed with drink and something uglier. "Just asking questions, boy," the largest one slurred. "About your ma. Whether she's friendly like, whether Mercer's been enjoying her company, if you know what I mean." "My mama's a lady," James said, his voice shaking but firm. His hand had found that boot knife again. "You take that back." "Easy, son." Frank's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "These gentlemen were just leaving. Mercer." The lead miner turned, swaying slightly. "Been meaning to talk to you about your new employee. Town's got questions about what exactly she's doing to earn her keep." Frank felt something dark and ancient stir in his chest, something he'd thought he'd left behind when he departed Philadelphia. "You're drunk, Morrison. Go home before you say something you'll regret." "Regret?" Morrison laughed, emboldened by alcohol and his companions. "Only one with regrets'll be you when everyone knows you're keeping a whore upstairs, and—" The next moment blurred. Frank moved with speed that surprised even him, his fist connecting with Morrison's jaw, with enough force to drop the larger man instantly. The other 2 miners started forward, but something in Frank's eyes stopped them cold. The next man who speaks about Mrs. Fletcher with anything less than respect will find himself banned from every reputable establishment in Copper Ridge, Frank said, his voice deadly quiet. "I'll make it my personal mission to ensure it." "Am I understood?" They helped their unconscious companion and fled. James stood frozen, his knife still clutched in his hand, staring at Frank with new understanding. "You didn't have to do that," the boy finally said. "Yes, I did." Frank examined his knuckles, already swelling. "Let's get you inside." Upstairs, Caroline took one look at Frank's hand and her son's shaken expression and pieced together what had happened. Her face went pale, then flushed with emotions Frank couldn't read. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she said after James had been sent to the other room. "Your reputation, your safety, were never as important as doing what's right." Frank flexed his injured hand. Besides, Morrison had that coming. He's been having trouble waiting to happen since his brother died in the mines last spring. Frank, Caroline's voice broke slightly. This can't continue. The town's turning against you because of us. Your position here, everything you've built, is it worthless if I have to pretend not to see injustice to maintain it? Frank moved closer, drawn by something he couldn't name. Caroline, I need to tell you something. She waited, her dark eyes wide in the lamplight. In Philadelphia, I was engaged to be married. Elizabeth Chambers, daughter of the law partner where I was articling. We'd known each other since childhood, and everyone assumed we'd marry after I returned from the war. The words came easier than expected, perhaps because he'd never spoken them aloud before. When I came home, I found she'd married my brother. 8 months earlier, quiet ceremony, nobody thought to mention it in their letters to me during the war. Caroline's hand moved involuntarily toward him, then stopped. Frank, I'm so sorry. I was angry, not just at them, but at myself for not seeing it coming. Michael was always the charming one, the easy one. I was too serious, too focused on duty. Elizabeth chose warmth over reliability. He smiled without humor. I left Philadelphia the day after I found out. Came west because I couldn't bear staying in a city full of people who pitied me, or worse, thought I was pathetic for caring. You're not pathetic. Caroline's voice was fierce. They were the ones who failed, both of them. Perhaps. But I learned something from it, that building walls around yourself, hiding from risk, doesn't actually protect you from pain. It just ensures you're alone when the pain comes anyway. Frank met her eyes directly. These past weeks, watching you fight for your sons, seeing your dignity, despite everything life's taken from you, it's reminded me that safety isn't the same as living. Why are you telling me this? Frank took a breath, feeling himself stepping off a cliff into unknown depths. Because, tomorrow, Adelaide Thornton and her delegation are planning to petition the mayor to force Maggie to dismiss you. Sheriff Grimsby warned me this afternoon. They're calling it a matter of public morality. Caroline's face crumpled, but she pulled herself together with visible effort. Then we'll leave tonight. I won't let them ruin you. Or, Frank said quietly, you could marry me. The words fell between them like stones into still water, creating ripples neither could control. Caroline stared at him as if he'd begun speaking a foreign language. What? Marry me. Make it legal and proper. Give yourself and your sons the protection of my name. Eliminate every question about propriety. Frank was speaking faster now, the words tumbling out before he could second-guess them. It would solve everything: your need for stability, the town's concerns about morality, the boys' security. Frank, that's insane. You don't marry someone out of charity. Who said anything about charity? Frank found himself moving closer, drawn by certainty he hadn't known he possessed. Caroline, you're the most remarkable woman I've ever met. Your strength, your intelligence, the way you've refused to let circumstances break you. I'd count myself fortunate to call you my wife. You barely know me. But something flickered in her eyes, hope perhaps, or terror at hoping. I know. You wake before dawn and can calculate compound interest in your head. I know you sing to Thomas when you think no one's listening, and you've taught James to read far beyond his years. I know you organize inventory with military precision, and you never take more food than you absolutely need, even though I've told you a dozen times to eat your fill. Frank's voice softened. I know you're terrified of being a burden, and you'd rather suffer than accept help, and I know that if you walk out of Copper Ridge tomorrow, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I'd been brave enough to ask you to stay. Caroline's eyes were bright with unshed tears. This is madness. A marriage of convenience to silence gossips, that's no foundation for a life together, isn't it? Frank found her hand with his, the touch electric. We already work well together. We already share space comfortably. We already care about each other's welfare. Some marriages start with less and build. to more. "And some marriages are prisons," Caroline whispered. "Frank, you don't understand what you're offering. I'm damaged goods, literally. I come with 2 children, no dowry, no prospects. I can't even perform half the tasks expected of a wife. I can't chop wood or carry water, or I don't need you to chop wood. I need—" Frank stopped, searching for words adequate to the moment. "I need someone who sees me as more than just the quiet bartender. Someone who understands what it means to start over, to build a new life from broken pieces. I think you need that too." The silence stretched between them, filled with possibility and fear in equal measure. Upstairs, they could hear James singing softly to his brother, the sound of childhood resilience that had survived everything the world threw at it. "If I said yes," Caroline began carefully, "it would have to be a real marriage, not in practice necessarily, but in appearance. The boys need stability, not another temporary arrangement that might dissolve. And you deserve the option to find actual love someday, not be trapped by an impulsive gesture. This isn't impulsive. I've been thinking about it since the day you told me you'd rather leave than damage my reputation." Frank squeezed her hand gently. "And as for love, maybe it comes before marriage, or maybe it grows after. Either way, I'm willing to find out." Caroline's tears finally fell, tracking silver paths down her cheeks. "I lost everything once before. My husband, my home, my arm, any sense of security. I don't know if I'm strong enough to risk loving someone again only to lose them. Then we'll build slowly. No pressure, no expectations beyond mutual respect and partnership." Frank used his thumb to wipe away her tears, a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. "We'll figure out the rest as we go. The town will say I trapped you, that I seduced you, or manipulated you. Let them say what they want, we'll know the truth." Caroline pulled back slightly, studying his face as if memorizing it. "You're absolutely certain? Because once we do this, there's no easy undoing it. You'd be tied to me, to my sons, to whatever comes. I've never been more certain of anything." And Frank realized with some surprise that it was true. In 3 weeks, this woman and her children had awakened something in him that 3 years of careful, measured existence hadn't touched. Then yes, Caroline's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, Frank Mercer, I'll marry you. God help us both." The wedding took place 3 days later at sunrise, attended only by Maggie, Dr. Hayes, Martha Dennison, Sheriff Grimsby, and Reverend Collins. James and Thomas stood on either side of their mother, confused but solemn in the gravity of the moment. Caroline wore a dress that Martha had altered from her own wardrobe, deep blue instead of widow's black, the left sleeve carefully taken in. Frank wore his Sunday suit, his injured hand still swollen, from the fight with Morrison bandaged discreetly. They spoke their vows in voices that didn't waver, promising to honor and cherish through whatever lay ahead. When Reverend Collins pronounced them husband and wife, Frank's kiss was chaste and gentle, a promise rather than a claim. Caroline's hand trembled in his, and he squeezed it reassuringly. "We'll make this work," he whispered against her ear. "We'd better," she whispered back, "because I think we just scandalized the entire territory." They weren't wrong. By noon, news of the marriage had spread throughout Copper Ridge, generating reactions that ranged from approval to outrage. The delegation planning to petition, the mayor dissolved in confusion. Married women were not subject to the same moral scrutiny as single ones. Adelaide Thornton declared the whole affair proof of manipulation and poor judgment. Others, like Martha and Maggie, expressed cautious hope that perhaps something good might come from such unconventional beginnings. That night, in what was now their shared room, Frank and Caroline navigated the awkwardness of new spouses who barely knew each other. Frank had rolled out a bedroll on the floor despite Caroline's protests. "I meant what I said about no pressure," he told her firmly. "We'll move at whatever pace makes sense. For now, the boys need to see stability, and we need to figure out how to actually be married. Thank you. Caroline's relief was palpable. Frank, I want you to know I'll try to be a good wife. I'll keep your house, mind your interests, raise the boys to respect you. I'll earn my place here. You already have. Frank settled onto his makeshift bed. Now get some sleep, Mrs. Mercer. Tomorrow we face Copper Ridge as a married couple, and something tells me it's going to be interesting. As Caroline drifted toward sleep, she allowed herself a cautious flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they'd found a way forward. A partnership built on mutual need and respect could work. People had married for less and built genuine affection over time. She couldn't have known that in 6 weeks Frank would lose his arm, saving James from a runaway ore wagon, forever binding them together in ways that went far beyond legal contracts or social convenience. That moment still lay ahead, waiting like a storm on the horizon. For now, there was only this, two damaged people choosing to face an uncertain future together and finding in that choice a strange, tentative peace. Winter arrived early in Copper Ridge that year, bringing with it complications no one had anticipated. The first snow fell just 2 weeks after Frank and Caroline's wedding, transforming the town into something beautiful and treacherous in equal measure. The mines slowed their operations as frozen ground made excavation difficult, which meant fewer workers with money to spend, which meant leaner times for businesses that depended on their patronage. The Golden Horn felt the impact immediately. Where October had seen steady crowds, November brought sparse attendance and careful spending. Men nursed single beers through entire evenings, and Maggie's profitable restaurant trade dwindled to a handful of orders per night. We'll need to trim expenses, Maggie told Frank and Caroline during an early morning meeting in the saloon's back office. I'm not letting anyone go, but hours will need to be reduced. Frank, you'll still draw full wages, but Caroline, I can only offer you 3 days a week instead of 6. Caroline's face remained composed, but Frank saw the tightening around her eyes. They'd been counting on her full wages to build savings, to purchase winter supplies for the boys, to establish some financial cushion against uncertainty. I understand, Miss Maggie. Whatever you can manage. After Maggie left, Caroline stared at the ledger before her, calculating and recalculating figures that wouldn't improve no matter how many times she added them. Frank watched her from the doorway, recognizing the set of her shoulders that meant she was fighting panic. We'll manage, he said quietly. Will we? Caroline's voice held an edge he hadn't heard before. Frank, the boys need winter coats. Thomas's boots have holes clear through the soles. We're already eating from Maggie's kitchen rather than buying our own supplies, which means we're dependent on her charity even as she's cutting our wages. How exactly are we managing? It was their first real disagreement as a married couple, born from stress and the grinding pressure of poverty that never quite released its grip. Frank recognized it for what it was, not anger at him specifically, but at circumstances that felt inescapable. I have savings, he offered, though the words felt inadequate even as he spoke them. Your savings, not ours. Caroline stood abruptly, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. Do you see the problem, Frank? I'm your wife in name, but in practice, I'm still a charity case. Still dependent, still unable to contribute equally, still one bad month away from being back in that alley. The fear beneath her words was raw and real. Frank moved closer, but she held up her hand, stopping him. I'm sorry. That was unfair. You've been nothing but generous, and I'm being ungrateful. She took a shaky breath. It's just hard, being helpless again. I thought marrying you would solve things, but it's only shifted which things I have to worry about. Then, let's solve them together. Frank kept his voice level, understanding that her anger needed space to exist without judgment. We'll use my savings for winter necessities. We'll look for other ways you can earn. There must be families who need help with bookkeeping or tutoring, and we'll stop pretending this marriage is anything other than what it's becoming." Caroline looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we're partners, Caroline. Not landlord and tenant, not employer and employee, not even really husband and wife in the traditional sense yet, but partners, figuring things out together. Which means my money is our money, and your worries are my worries, and we stop keeping careful accounts of who owes what to whom." Something in her face softened, though worry remained etched in the lines around her mouth. "That's a lovely sentiment, Frank, but marriage doesn't erase the reality that I bring nothing to this partnership except mouths to feed and problems to solve. You bring yourself. That's not nothing." Before Caroline could respond, James burst into the office, his face flushed with cold and excitement. "Mr. Frank, there's a man outside asking for Mama. Says he knows her from before." Every muscle in Caroline's body went rigid. The color drained from her face so completely that Frank instinctively moved to support her. "What man?" Her voice was barely audible. Didn't say his name. Just said to tell Mrs. Caroline Fletcher. James paused, correcting himself. "Mrs. Caroline Mercer. An old friend wants to speak with her." Frank felt Caroline's hand find his arm, gripping with surprising strength. "James, go upstairs with Thomas. Don't come down until I call for you." "But Mama now, James. Please." The boy recognized the tone and obeyed without further argument. Once he was gone, Caroline turned to Frank, and he saw genuine terror in her eyes. "I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you before we married, but I was afraid." Her voice broke. "His name is Vernon Fletcher, my late husband's brother, and if he's found us, we're in more trouble than you can imagine." The man, waiting in the saloon's main room, was tall and well-dressed, with the kind of groomed appearance that marked him as someone with money and the time to spend it on vanity. His resemblance to the portrait Caroline kept of her late husband was striking. Same sharp features, same calculating eyes, but where her husband's photograph suggested warmth, this man radiated something colder. "Caroline." Vernon Fletcher's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Or should I say, Mrs. Mercer? I hear congratulations are in order." "What do you want, Vernon?" "Straight to business." "That's new, you used to have better manners." He turned his attention to Frank, assessing him with a glance that managed to be both dismissive and threatening. "You must be the savior, the noble bartender who rescued the poor widow. Tell me, did she mention that she's stolen property?" "Watch your mouth," Frank said quietly, but Vernon laughed. "Not stolen herself, though one could argue she's conned you quite thoroughly. I'm speaking of the boys. My nephews, who legally belong with family, meaning me, not with some stranger their mother married to avoid her responsibilities." Caroline's hand found Frank's again, her grip painful. "The boys are my sons. You have no claim to them." "Actually, I do. Kansas law is quite clear on the matter of orphan children and nearest male relatives. When their father died, guardianship should have passed to me. Instead, you ran off with them before proper arrangements could be made." Vernon's smile turned sharp. "I've spent considerable time and money tracking you down, Caroline. Did you really think you could hide in Colorado forever?" "There was no need for guardianship because they weren't orphans, they had a mother," Frank interjected. "Unless Kansas law has changed to make women legally dead, your claim seems questionable." Vernon's eyes narrowed. "A one-armed woman living in poverty can hardly provide proper care for two growing boys. The court will see reason, especially when I explain how she's been dragging them across the frontier, exposing them to dangers and deprivation. That youngest one nearly died of pneumonia, I hear. Hardly exemplary maternal care. Get out." Frank's voice was still quiet, but something in it made Vernon pause. "Get out of this establishment and don't come back. If you have legal claims, pursue to them through proper channels. But you don't threaten my wife under my roof. Your wife." Vernon's laugh was ugly. "You've known her, what, a month? 2? And you've already been foolish enough to marry her? She's using you, Bartender. The minute something better comes along, she'll... Frank moved faster than Vernon anticipated, grabbing the man's expensive coat and propelling him toward the door with enough force to make his intentions clear. Out, now, before I forget that I'm trying to be a law-abiding citizen. Vernon stumbled onto the street, his composure cracked but his malice intact. This isn't over, Caroline. Those boys are Fletcher blood, and they belong with Fletchers. You've got 1 week to come to your senses before I return with a federal marshal and court papers. Enjoy your little fantasy marriage while it lasts. After he left, Caroline sank into the nearest chair, her entire body shaking. Frank locked the door and knelt beside her, taking her hand in both of his. "Tell me everything." The story came out in fractured pieces. Vernon had always coveted his brother's success, the farm, the respect in their Kansas community, the beautiful, educated wife. When news of his brother's death at Shiloh arrived, Vernon had immediately begun positioning himself to inherit everything, claiming that a woman alone couldn't manage a farming operation. He'd offered to take the boys to ease Caroline's burden, an offer she recognized as a thinly veiled attempt to control her late husband's estate through his children. "He was always cruel," Caroline whispered. "Even when my husband was alive, Vernon would visit and make comments about how I was too educated for a farmer's wife, how I didn't know my place. After the accident that took my arm, he started saying I was unfit, that I should give him the boys and retire to some charitable institution." She looked up at Frank with haunted eyes. "He wants them because they're leverage, Frank. The farm went to them in my husband's will, with me as guardian until they're of age. If Vernon gets guardianship, he controls everything. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because I was afraid you'd realize what you were getting into and send us away. A wife with complications is one thing. A wife whose late husband's brother is actively pursuing legal action to take her children, that's something else entirely." Tears tracked down her face. "I'm so sorry, Frank. I should have told you, but I was desperate and scared, and—" "Stop!" Frank's voice was firm but not unkind. "We're past apologies. Now we focus on solutions. Can he actually make good on his threats? I don't know. The law is murky about women's rights to their own children, especially women who are—" She gestured at her missing arm. "Disabled, and Vernon has money, connections. He knows lawyers and judges. I'm just a widow who's been living hand to mouth. No, you're a married woman with a husband who has some resources of his own." Frank was already thinking, his legal training from his abbreviated law studies finally useful. "We need to get ahead of this. Doc Hayes can testify about Thomas's recovery, about the care you've provided. Maggie, Martha, even Sheriff Grimsby, they can all speak to your character and competence. And most importantly, you're no longer destitute. You're a married woman with a stable home." "But for how long?" Caroline's voice broke. "Frank, if this goes to court, it could drag on for months, cost money we don't have. And even if we win, Vernon won't stop. He'll find other ways to make our lives impossible. That's who he is, vindictive and patient." They sat in silence, the weight of the situation settling over them like the snow accumulating outside. Upstairs, they could hear James and Thomas moving around, the sounds of childhood continuing despite the adult catastrophes brewing below. "We fight," Frank said finally. "That's what we do. We gather testimony, we document everything, we show any court that might consider Vernon's claims that those boys are exactly where they belong." Over the following days, that's exactly what they did. Dr. Hayes provided written statements about Thomas's illness and recovery, emphasizing Caroline's devoted care. Maggie documented Caroline's employment and competence despite her disability. Martha wrote eloquently about James's education and Thomas's progress in informal lessons. Sheriff Grimsby quietly investigated Vernon Fletcher's background, discovering a man with substantial debts and a reputation for sharp business practices that sometimes crossed ethical lines. But Vernon wasn't idle either. He took a room at Copper Ridge's hotel and began his own campaign, spreading carefully worded concerns about Caroline's fitness as a mother. He bought drinks for miners and merchants, sympathizing with their hard times, while mentioning how tragic it was that his nephews were being kept from family who could provide proper advantages. He attended church services and made donations, presenting himself as the concerned uncle, just wanting what was best for his late brother's children. The town, already divided about Frank and Caroline's marriage, split further. Some saw Vernon as a legitimate relative with reasonable concerns. Others recognized him for what he was, a schemer using grief and law to pursue selfish ends. The conflict created tensions that affected everything from who shopped where to who sat with whom at church. James, meanwhile, was struggling with complications of his own. The boy had been enrolled in Martha's school, but his protective instincts and his awareness of the threat Vernon represented made him tense and combative. He got into fights with boys who repeated things their parents had said about his mother. He skipped classes to keep watch on Vernon's hotel, trying to gather intelligence. He pushed back against Frank's attempts at discipline, seeing him as an outsider despite the marriage. "He doesn't trust you yet," Caroline explained, after a particularly difficult evening when James had openly defied Frank's instruction to stay away from Vernon's hotel. In his mind, every man except his father has been a threat or a disappointment. He's waiting for you to prove you're different, but he's also terrified of being wrong. The tension came to a head on a bitter cold morning 3 weeks after Vernon's arrival. James, disobeying explicit instructions, had followed Vernon through town, trying to hear what the man was planning. Vernon, aware of being followed, led the boy into an alley and confronted him. "Spying, James, that's rude, even for a child being raised by such questionable influences. You leave my mama alone." James's hand had found his knife, though he made no move to draw it. "Your mama," Vernon's voice dripped with contempt. "Is that what you call the woman who's dragging you through poverty instead of letting family take proper care of you? The woman who married a stranger rather than accept help from blood relatives?" The fight was brief but violent. James, pushed beyond endurance, lunged at Vernon with his knife. The man, larger and stronger, easily overpowered the boy, twisting his arm until the weapon fell. But the struggle had drawn attention, and by the time Sheriff Grimsby arrived, a crowd had gathered. "He attacked me," Vernon declared, showing the tear in his expensive coat where James's knife had caught fabric but not flesh. "Unprovoked assault with a deadly weapon. I could have been killed. And this is the environment those boys are being raised in? Violence and desperation?" Grimsby took James into custody, more for the boy's protection than anything else, but the damage was done. Vernon's accusations had physical evidence now. James, terrified and ashamed, wouldn't speak to anyone except to insist he'd been defending his mother. Caroline was devastated. "This is my fault. I let my fear make me run instead of facing Vernon. Years ago, and now James is paying the price." "James is paying the price of Vernon's manipulation," Frank corrected. "The man goaded a child into attacking him, probably deliberately, to strengthen his custody case." That night, as Frank lay awake on his bedroll, they'd maintained the sleeping arrangement despite everything else. He heard Caroline crying quietly. He'd heard it before, but always pretended not to notice, respecting her need for private grief. But tonight felt different. "Caroline," he kept his voice soft. "I'm fine. Go back to sleep. You're not fine, and I'm not sleeping." Frank sat up. "Talk to me." In the darkness, her voice was small and lost. "I can't lose them, Frank. They're all I have left of their father, all that makes sense in a world that took everything else. If Vernon wins, if some court decides I'm unfit, I don't know what I'll do." Frank made a decision then, crossing the room to sit beside her on the bed they still didn't share. "You won't lose. With them. I promise you that. Whatever it takes, whatever I have to do, those boys stay with us." Caroline's hand found his in the darkness. "How can you promise that? You're not God, Frank. You can't control courts or laws or vindictive relatives." "No, but I can make sure we present the strongest possible case. I can use every resource I have, call in every favor, fight with everything in me." He squeezed her hand. "I made vows to you, Caroline, to honor you, to stand beside you. That includes standing beside those boys because they're part of you." Why? The question she'd asked so many times before, but now with a different shading. Why invest so much in someone else's fight? You could walk away, get the marriage annulled, return to your quiet life. Because that quiet life wasn't a life at all. It was hiding. Frank found himself speaking truths he'd barely acknowledged to himself. "You asked me once why I helped you that first day. I said someone helped me once, but that's not the whole truth. The truth is, I saw myself in you, someone who'd been broken by circumstances, trying to rebuild with whatever pieces remained. And I thought maybe, just maybe, if I could help you, it would prove that redemption is possible. That starting over means something." Caroline was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice held wonder. "You're not who I thought you were when we married. I thought you were just kind, just decent, but you're more than that. You're brave in ways that have nothing to do with physical courage." "I'm scared most of the time," Frank admitted. "Scared I'm not enough. Not smart enough or strong enough or capable enough to protect you and the boys from what's coming. Then we'll be scared together." Caroline's hand tightened on his. "And maybe together we'll be enough." They sat that way for a while, hands joined in the darkness, two damaged people drawing strength from each other in the face of mounting threats. Neither mentioned that Vernon's deadline was approaching, or that James sat in a cell at the sheriff's office, or that the entire town was watching to see how this improbable marriage would weather its first real storm. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Copper Ridge in white that would eventually become grey with ash and mud and the thousand small compromises of frontier life. But for now, in that moment, it remained pristine, a temporary perfection that couldn't last but was beautiful while it did. Tomorrow would bring new complications. Vernon's machinations, James's trial, the custody battle looming on the horizon. But tonight, Frank and Caroline had each other, and that would have to be enough. It would need to be enough, because what was coming would test them beyond anything either had yet imagined. The hearing was set for December 15th, to be presided over by Circuit Judge Nathaniel Blackwood, who traveled through the Colorado Territory, dispensing justice in towns too small for permanent courts. His reputation preceded him fair but traditional, with little patience for unconventional arrangements or arguments that strayed from established legal precedent. Vernon Fletcher had hired counsel from Denver, a sharp-tongued attorney named Horace Pemberton, who specialized in estate and custody disputes. Frank and Caroline, lacking funds for equivalent representation, relied on Frank's incomplete legal education and the support of witnesses willing to testify without compensation. The week before the hearing, tensions in Copper Ridge reached a breaking point. James had been released from Sheriff Grimsby's custody with a stern warning, but the incident had given Vernon exactly the ammunition he'd sought. The boy was now painted as dangerous, unstable, a product of inadequate maternal supervision. "They're saying, I'm raising criminals," Caroline told Frank, her voice brittle with exhaustion. They sat in the saloon's empty main room late at night, reviewing documents, for the 100th time. "That my disability makes me incapable of properly disciplining children, that James's violence proves I've failed as a mother. James defended himself against a man who's been systematically terrorizing his family," Frank countered, but they both knew how the incident would play out in court. Facts mattered less than perception, and Vernon had shaped the perception masterfully. Thomas, too young to fully understand the legal machinations but old enough to sense the danger, had grown clingy and fearful. He refused to let Caroline out of his sight, following her from room to room, his small hand constantly seeking hers. The boy's nightmares had returned, bringing with them the fever dreams from his illness weeks earlier. "Mama's not leaving," James would whisper to his brother in the darkness, though his own voice shook with uncertainty. "Mr. Frank won't let them take us." But James's faith in Frank was as fragile as everything else. The boy oscillated between desperate need for a father figure and fierce rejection of anyone trying to fill that role. He obeyed Frank's instructions with obvious resentment, questioned every decision, tested boundaries with the determination of someone convinced that any security was temporary. 3 days before the hearing, Frank found James in the stable behind the saloon, methodically sharpening his knife on a whetstone. The boy's face was set in lines too hard for his age. "Planning something?" Frank asked, keeping his tone neutral. "Just making sure I'm ready." "Ready for what?" James's jaw tightened. "For whatever comes. If that judge says we have to go with Uncle Vernon, I'm not going quiet. I'll run, take Thomas with me, disappear into the mountains if I have to." Frank settled onto a hay bale, giving the boy space. "And your mother? You'd leave her behind?" "She could come too." But James's voice betrayed the fantasy for what it was. Winter in the mountains with no supplies, no shelter, 2 children, and a woman with 1 arm. You'd all be dead in a week. Frank's bluntness made James flinch, but the boy needed truth, not comfort. "Running isn't the answer, James. Fighting this legally is. Legal fighting doesn't work for people like us," James spat. "The law's for rich men like Uncle Vernon, not for widows and kids nobody wants." "I want you." The words came out before Frank could consider them, raw and honest. "Your mother wants you, and there are enough people in this town who'll stand up for your family that we have a fighting chance." James's knife stilled on the whetstone. "Why do you even care? We're not really your family. You married Mama because people were talking, and now you're stuck with us. Once this is over, once Uncle Vernon gives up or wins, you'll go back to your regular life. Is that what you think?" Frank moved closer, crouching to meet the boy's eyes. "James, I married your mother because I saw in her something I'd lost in myself, the courage to keep going, when everything's gone wrong. And you and Thomas, you're part of that, part of her, which makes you part of this marriage whether you believe it or not." "Words," James's voice cracked. "Everyone says words. Uncle Vernon said words too, about family and blood and what's best for us. But words don't mean nothing when the judge makes his decision. Then let me prove it with actions." Frank stood, offering his hand. "Help me prepare for this hearing. Tell me everything you remember about your uncle, about Kansas, about anything that might help our case. Trust me enough to fight this the right way." James stared at the offered hand for a long moment. Finally, slowly, he took it, allowing Frank to pull him to his feet. The knife remained clenched in his other hand, but it was something. The next 2 days were a blur of preparation. Frank interviewed James extensively, documenting Vernon's history of cruelty and financial pressure tactics. Caroline provided written accounts of her marriage, her husband's death, the accident that took her arm, Vernon's immediate attempts to seize control of the estate. Martha prepared statements about James's academic progress and Thomas's development. Doc Hayes drafted medical testimony about Caroline's capability despite her disability, but Vernon had been equally busy. His lawyer had gathered depositions from Kansas neighbors describing Caroline's struggle to manage the farm alone, the financial difficulties that led to foreclosure, James's increasing behavioral problems in school before they fled. He'd obtained medical opinions suggesting that traumatic amputation often led to mental instability in women. He'd even found a child welfare advocate from Denver, willing to testify that children of disabled mothers faced elevated risks of neglect. "It's all twisted," Caroline said, reading through the documents Vernon's lawyer had filed. "They're taking true facts and painting them to make me look incompetent. Yes, I couldn't manage the farm alone. That's why the bank foreclosed, not because I didn't try. Yes, James had problems in school because Vernon kept showing up, pressuring him, trying to turn him against me. The night before the hearing, none of them could sleep." Caroline sat at the window, watching snow fall through the lamplight. James lay rigid on his pallet, staring at the ceiling. Thomas whimpered softly in his sleep, and Frank paced the floor below, reviewing arguments that felt increasingly inadequate. At dawn, they dressed in their finest clothes. Caroline in the blue dress from their wedding, Frank in his Sunday suit, the boys in outfits purchased with money they could barely spare. They walked to the town hall where the hearing would be held, a solemn procession that drew stares from early-rising citizens. Judge Blackwood was a severe man in his 60s, with steel-grey hair and eyes that seemed to look through rather than at people. He established his court with brisk efficiency, laying out procedures and making clear his intolerance for emotional displays or legal theatrics. Vernon's lawyer went first, building his case with surgical precision. He presented Caroline's financial struggles, her disability, the incident with James and the knife, the instability of her recent marriage to a man she'd known only weeks before accepting his proposal. He called witnesses who described seeing the Fletcher family begging, sleeping rough, living in conditions no children should endure. "And where was Mrs. Fletcher during all this hardship?" Pemberton asked rhetorically. She was dragging her sons across the frontier, exposing them to dangers and deprivation rather than accepting the help of family. Rather than acknowledging her own limitations and putting her children's welfare above her pride. Frank watched Caroline's face remain impassive, though her hand beneath the table gripped his with painful intensity. James sat ramrod straight, his jaw clenched so tight Frank worried the boy's teeth might crack. Thomas, blessedly, had been deemed too young to attend and was being watched by Maggie at the saloon. When it was their turn, Frank presented their witnesses methodically. Doc Hayes testified about Caroline's competent care during Thomas's illness. Martha spoke eloquently about the boy's education and well-being. Sheriff Grimsby described Vernon's deliberate provocation of James, painting the knife incident in its proper context. But Judge Blackwood's questions were pointed. "Mr. Mercer, you married Mrs. Fletcher after knowing her how long?" 3 weeks, Your Honor. "And in those 3 weeks, you determined she was a suitable wife and mother? Or were there perhaps other motivations, charitable impulses that, while admirable, don't necessarily indicate genuine commitment?" Frank chose his words carefully. "I married Caroline because I recognized in her a strength of character that I admired. The circumstances were unusual, but my commitment is genuine. Commitment is easy to claim, harder to prove." The judge's eyes were cold. "What happens when the novelty wears off, when the burden of supporting a disabled woman and 2 children becomes onerous? Will this marriage last, or will these boys find themselves displaced yet again?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable in any way that would satisfy. Frank could only insist on his sincerity, but words felt hollow against the judge's skepticism. The hearing recessed for lunch, and Frank found James in the alley behind the town hall, his face ashen. "He's going to side with Uncle Vernon, I can tell. We're going to lose. We haven't lost yet." But Frank's voice lacked conviction. The judge's questions had revealed his bias toward traditional family structures, toward blood relations, over legal marriages of convenience. When they reconvened, Judge Blackwood delivered preliminary thoughts that confirmed James's fears. "While I'm not unsympathetic to Mrs. Mercer's situation, I must consider what arrangement best serves the children's interests." Mr. Vernon Fletcher represents stability, financial resources, a traditional household, established community standing. Mr. and Mrs. Mercer represent uncertainty, a new marriage, limited means, unconventional circumstances. Your Honor, Frank interrupted, knowing he was risking contempt but unable to remain silent. With respect, blood relation doesn't guarantee character. Vernon Fletcher has demonstrated calculated cruelty toward his sister-in-law and nephews. His interest in these boys stems from financial control, not genuine concern. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Mercer. Do you have proof? Frank didn't. He had suspicions, logical inferences, witness observations of Vernon's behavior, but concrete proof of motive? That was lacking. Judge Blackwood sighed. I'll render my decision in the morning. Until then, the boys remain in their current custody, but all parties are to refrain from any contact that might constitute intimidation or coercion. They walked back to the saloon in defeated silence. James broke away from the group as soon as they arrived, disappearing into the streets despite Caroline's calls. Frank knew where the boy was heading, to Vernon's hotel, to watch, to plan whatever desperate measures he'd convinced himself were necessary. I should go after him, Caroline said, but Frank shook his head. I'll go. You stay with Thomas. The boy's already terrified. Seeing you upset will only make it worse. Frank found James exactly where expected, lurking in the alley across from the hotel. But the boy wasn't alone. Vernon himself stood in the shadows nearby, clearly having expected this exact scenario. Come to collect your stepson, Vernon's voice was mocking. Boy's been following me all day, making threats. Perhaps I should report this to Sheriff Grimsby, add stalking to his list of offences. You're baiting a child, Frank said flatly, deliberately provoking him to create more evidence for your case. I'm defending myself from a violent young man with poor impulse control and worse judgment. Vernon smiled. Honestly, Mercer, what did you think would happen? That you'd play hero, marry the widow, and everything would work out? Life doesn't reward foolish gestures. Neither does the law reward manipulative relatives. Frank moved to collect James, but Vernon's next words stopped him cold. The judge has already made his decision. Called me to his hotel room an hour ago to inform me privately. Professional courtesy between men of standing. Tomorrow's formality, but the boys are mine. Might want to prepare your wife for that reality. The words hit like physical blows. Frank searched Vernon's face for signs of deception, but found only smug certainty. Whether the claim was true or another manipulation didn't matter, the effect was the same. James heard it too. The boy's face went white, then red with rage. Before Frank could react, James bolted not toward Vernon, but away from both of them, running with the desperate speed of someone whose entire world was collapsing. James! Frank gave chase, Vernon's laughter following them into the darkness. The boy was fast and knew Copper Ridge's alleys better than Frank did. By the time Frank caught up, James had reached the mining district on the edge of town, where massive ore wagons waited for morning transport. The boy had climbed onto one of the loaded wagons, his knife out, slashing at the brake ropes with frantic determination. James, stop! Frank climbed up after him, the wagon creaking under their combined weight. This won't solve anything. I'll crash this into his hotel, destroy his stuff, make him leave. The boy's voice was breaking, tears streaming down his face. I have to do something. This isn't the way. Frank reached for the knife, but James jerked away, and the movement upset his balance on the loaded ore. The boy stumbled, his feet sliding on loose rocks, his body tilting toward the wagon's edge, where a 20-foot drop to hard ground waited. Frank didn't think. He lunged, grabbing James with his left hand, while his right grasped for purchase on the wagon's side. He caught the boy, arrested his fall, pulled him back from the edge, but the wagon, its brake ropes already weakened by James's knife work, chose that moment to break free. The massive weight began rolling down the slight grade toward the street below, picking up speed with each rotation of its wheels. Frank threw James clear, watching the boy land hard but safely on the packed earth of the staging area. Then the wagon jerked violently as its wheel caught a rut, and Frank felt himself falling, his body sliding down the pile of ore toward the moving wheels that could crush a man's bones to powder. His left arm caught in the wagon's side mechanism, some gear or lever, he'd never know which. There was a moment of impossible tension, his body suspended between falling and catching, his arm twisted at an angle that shouldn't exist. Then came the sound, not pain, yet that would come later, but sound. A wet crack, a tearing, a separation of things that were meant to stay connected. Frank's scream tore through the night, animal and involuntary, and the last thing he saw before shock swallowed consciousness was James's face, horror-struck and disbelieving, as the boy realized what had just happened, what Frank Mercer had just sacrificed to save him. The hours following the accident blurred into a nightmare of blood and desperate action. Dr. Hayes worked through the night in his surgery, fighting to save what remained of Frank's left arm, or rather, fighting to remove it cleanly enough that infection wouldn't claim his life, along with the limb. Caroline sat outside the surgery door, her remaining hand pressed against her mouth to stifle sounds that might distract the doctor. She'd arrived within minutes of the accident, summoned by miners who'd heard the commotion and Frank's screams. She'd seen the wreckage of the wagon, the blood pooling on the ground, Frank's arm twisted at angles that made her stomach revolt. James sat beside her, silent and rigid, his clothes still stained with Frank's blood from trying to help before Hayes arrived. The boy hadn't spoken since it happened, hadn't responded to questions or comfort, hadn't even cried. He simply stared at the surgery door with eyes that had aged years in minutes. Martha Dennison had taken Thomas back to the saloon, shielding the younger boy from the horror. Maggie paced the hallway, alternating between prayer and profanity. Sheriff Grimsby stood guard, preventing curious townspeople from crowding too close, though word had spread through Copper Ridge like wildfire. Vernon Fletcher appeared around midnight, his expression carefully arranged into concern that didn't reach his eyes. "I heard about the accident. Terrible business. If there's anything I can get out," Caroline's voice was flat and deadly. "This is your fault. You pushed James to desperation, and Frank paid the price. I hardly think you can blame me for your stepson's violent tendencies." "Out." Sheriff Grimsby moved between Vernon and Caroline. "Nothing you need to be here for. Best move along." Vernon left with poorly concealed satisfaction, and Caroline understood with sick certainty that he viewed Frank's injury as advantageous to his case. A one-armed bartender married to a one-armed widow, both now damaged and dependent, how could such a household provide proper stability for children? Dawn was breaking when Dr. Hayes finally emerged, his surgical apron soaked with blood, exhaustion written in every line of his face. He pulled off his spectacles, cleaning them with shaking hands before meeting Caroline's eyes. "He's alive. The arm's gone from just below the elbow. I managed to stop the bleeding, close the wound cleanly. If infection doesn't set in, he should survive." "Should?" Caroline's voice cracked. "I've done everything I can medically. The rest depends on him, his strength, his will to recover." Hayes's expression grew more troubled. "But Caroline, you need to understand what this means. The physical recovery will be difficult, but the psychological impact of losing a limb. I've seen strong men shattered by it. Seen them give up, lose themselves to drink or despair. Frank's going to need support beyond anything I can provide as a physician." Caroline thought of her own dark months after losing her arm, the moments when death seemed preferable to learning to live diminished. "Can I see him?" "He's unconscious from the ether. Will be for a few hours yet, when he wakes." Hayes trailed off, then continued gently. When he wakes, he'll realize what he's lost. That first awareness is the hardest moment. Someone should be there. I'll be there. Caroline turned to James, who hadn't moved throughout the doctor's report. James, you need to go back to the saloon. Clean up, check on your brother, get some rest. The boy finally looked at her, and the anguish in his young face was devastating. I killed him. He's alive, James. I killed who he was. Mr. Frank can't be a bartender with one arm, can't do half the things he used to do. And it's because of me, because I was stupid and angry, and his voice broke completely. I wish it had been me instead. Caroline knelt before her son, gripping his shoulders with her single hand. Listen to me. Frank chose to save you. That was his decision, his action. You don't get to make his sacrifice meaningless by drowning in guilt. How do I live with this? The question was raw, desperate. The same way I learned to live with one arm. One day at a time, one task at a time, accepting help when you need it and offering it when you can. She pulled him close. And by being there for Frank, the way he's been there for us. He's going to need us, James, all of us. Throughout the day, Copper Ridge learned the full story of the accident, and the town's judgment shifted like sand in the wind. Those who'd questioned Frank's motives in marrying Caroline found their skepticism answer in blood and sacrifice. Those who'd sided with Vernon Fletcher's claims about unstable children and inadequate guardianship reconsidered in light of a man who'd given his arm to save a boy, not his own blood. Changes things, doesn't it? Thomas Brennan observed at the hardware store, addressing a cluster of men who'd gathered to discuss the situation. Man doesn't lose a limb for someone he's pretending to care about. Vernon Fletcher's going to have a harder time convincing Judge Blackwood that the Mercers are an unfit household. Sheriff Grimsby added, his words spreading through town by afternoon. Hard to argue instability when a husband's willing to sacrifice his own body to protect his wife's child. Adelaide Thornton, who'd led the charge against Caroline's employment and Frank's marriage, found herself isolated when she attempted to maintain her position. A tragic accident doesn't erase questions about propriety. It erases questions about character. Martha Dennison interrupted coldly. Which is what you've been questioning all along, Adelaide. Frank Mercer proved his character last night. What have you proved except your capacity for judgment? When Frank finally woke, late that afternoon, Caroline was sitting beside his bed as promised. She watched consciousness return to his eyes, saw the confusion, then the memory flooding back. His right hand moved instinctively to his left arm, finding only bandages and absence. No, the word came out strangled. No, that was. I thought maybe I dreamed. I'm so sorry. Caroline took his remaining hand in hers. Dr. Hayes did everything he could, but the damage was too severe. Frank's face crumpled, and Caroline witnessed the exact moment Hayes had warned about the crushing realization of permanent loss. Frank turned his face away, his body shaking with silent grief that carved something deep in Caroline's chest. James? Frank finally managed, bruised but otherwise unharmed. Because of you. Caroline moved closer, her own missing arm suddenly feeling like a bridge rather than a barrier. Frank, look at me, please. He turned back slowly, and Caroline saw in his eyes the same lost desperation she'd felt 18 months ago when she'd woken from her own amputation surgery. I know what you're feeling right now, she said quietly. The shock, the disbelief, the certainty that you'll never be whole again. I know because I've lived it. And I'm not going to lie to you, it's going to be hard. Harder than anything you've faced. You're going to hate the limitations, mourn the loss, rage against the unfairness. How did you... Frank's voice broke. How did you survive it? Honestly? I didn't. Not at first. I wanted to die for weeks after the accident, couldn't see a future worth living, but then I looked at my boys, and I realized they'd already lost their father. They couldn't lose me too, even a damaged version of me. She squeezed his hand. You have people who need you, Frank. Me, James, Thomas. We're not going to let you disappear into despair. I'm useless now. Can't tend bar, can't provide for— Stop. Caroline's voice turned sharp. You think I'm useless? That my life has no value because I have one arm? No, of course not, but that's different. It's exactly the same. You're going to learn what I learned, that worth isn't measured in physical completeness, that people who love you don't keep ledgers of what you can't do anymore. Her eyes held his. You married me when I had one arm, when I came with nothing but problems and children and need. Did you think I valued you only for what you could do with two hands? Frank stared at her, the question hanging between them. Before he could answer, James appeared in the doorway, his face pale and set with determination. Can I come in? Caroline nodded, and the boy approached the bed with visible trepidation. When he saw Frank's bandaged stump where his left arm had been, James made a sound like a wounded animal. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I ruined everything, and I'd do anything to take it back. And James— Frank's voice was weak, but clear. Come here. The boy moved closer, and Frank reached out with his remaining hand, pulling James into an awkward embrace that made them both wince, Frank from his injuries, James from the weight of guilt. You listen to me, Frank said into the boy's hair. I made a choice last night. Not a sacrifice I resent, not a burden I'll hold against you, but a choice. Because that's what fathers do. They protect their children, whatever the cost. James pulled back, tears streaming down his face. But you're not my father. Maybe not by blood. But after last night, I think we're past pretending this is just a convenient arrangement. Frank's eyes found Caroline's. All of us are. The hearing resumed the next morning despite Frank's injury, or perhaps because of it. Judge Blackwood had spent the previous evening interviewing multiple witnesses about the accident, and his demeanor had shifted noticeably when court reconvened. Frank insisted on attending despite Hayes's protests, appearing in court with his left arm heavily bandaged and supported by a sling. The sight of him drew gasps from the gallery, and even Vernon Fletcher's confidence seemed shaken. Judge Blackwood addressed the court with unusual gravity. Yesterday's events have cast this case in a new light. I've spent considerable time reviewing testimony and considering the facts. Mr. Fletcher, your concerns about household stability and appropriate guardianship are not without merit on paper. However, the law must consider not just material circumstances, but the bonds of affection and commitment that constitute true family. Vernon leaned forward, sensing victory, but the judge continued. Frank Mercer sacrificed his livelihood and physical integrity to save James Fletcher from serious injury or death. This action demonstrates a level of parental commitment that transcends legal definitions. Moreover, testimony from multiple witnesses indicates that Vernon Fletcher deliberately provoked the child, creating the circumstances that led to this tragedy. Your Honor, I must object, Pemberton began, but Blackwood silenced him with a look. Mr. Fletcher, I find your claim to guardianship stems more from financial interest than genuine concern for these children's welfare. The boys have a mother who, despite significant hardship, has maintained their care and education. She now has a husband who has proven his devotion beyond any reasonable doubt. The judge's gavel came down with finality. Custody remains with Caroline Mercer. This case is dismissed. The courtroom erupted. Vernon surged to his feet, his face purple with rage. This is outrageous. Those boys are Fletcher blood. Those boys are Mercer children now, Blackwood interrupted coldly. And if you continue to harass this family, I'll hold you in contempt. This court is adjourned. Caroline felt her knees buckle with relief, and only Martha's quick support kept her upright. James stood frozen, as if afraid to believe what he'd just heard. Even Thomas, who'd been allowed to attend the final session, seemed stunned by the sudden reversal of fortune. Frank sat quietly, his face pale from pain and exhaustion, but when Caroline caught his eye, he smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes despite everything. Vernon stormed from the courtroom, Pemberton trailing behind with apologies and justifications. As they passed, Vernon paused long enough to lean close to Frank. "Enjoy your victory, Mercer. But remember, you're a cripple now, married to a cripple, trying to raise children in a saloon. How long before it all falls apart?" Frank met his gaze steadily. "Long enough to prove you wrong about what makes a family." After they'd left, Judge Blackwood approached the Mercers privately. "Mr. Mercer, a word of advice from someone who's seen many situations like this. The legal battle is over, but the harder fight begins now. Recovery from amputation is as much mental as physical. You'll face dark days, question your worth, struggle with tasks that used to be simple. Don't face those days alone." "He won't," Caroline said firmly, her hand finding Frank's. "We understand something about recovery in this family." The judge nodded, his stern expression softening slightly. "I believe you do. Good luck to all of you." The walk back to the Golden Horn felt surreal, like moving through a dream where everything had shifted but not yet settled into new reality. Townspeople stopped them every few feet, some offering congratulations, others expressing concern for Frank's injury, all of them witnessing the transformation of the Mercer family from scandal to something approaching heroic. At the saloon, Maggie had prepared a celebration of sorts, though the mood was tempered by awareness of Frank's pain and the challenges ahead. Dr. Hayes insisted Frank rest, administering laudanum for the pain over Frank's weak protests. "You're no use to anyone if you collapse from exhaustion," Hayes said firmly. "Take the medicine, sleep. Tomorrow's soon enough to worry about what comes next." As the drug took effect, pulling Frank toward unconsciousness, he felt Caroline's hand in his, heard James and Thomas's voices nearby, and experienced something unexpected peace. Not happiness exactly, not with his arm gone and his livelihood in question, but peace nonetheless, the kind that comes from knowing you've done the right thing, regardless of cost. "We're going to be okay," Caroline whispered, though whether she was speaking to him or to herself, Frank couldn't tell. "Yes," he managed to reply before sleep claimed him. "We are." In the days that followed, that optimism would be tested repeatedly. Frank would face moments of crushing depression. Caroline would struggle to support them on reduced income. The boys would navigate their own trauma and guilt. Vernon Fletcher would leave Copper Ridge, but not before spreading rumors that would follow the Mercers for years. But in that moment, with his family gathered close and the immediate threat vanquished, Frank Mercer allowed himself to believe that sacrifice and love might actually be enough to build something lasting from broken pieces. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tomorrow could wait. For now, there was only this: a one-armed bartender and a one-armed widow, two children who'd found a father, and the stubborn, impossible hope that redemption was more than just a word. It was a choice, made daily, sometimes hourly, to believe that being broken didn't mean being beyond repair. Spring came late to Copper Ridge that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it a thaw that seemed to extend beyond the physical world. The snow melted from the mountains in rushing torrents, filling Silver Creek until it roared past town with a voice that spoke of renewal and unstoppable forward motion. Frank stood at the window of their room above the saloon, watching the morning light paint the peaks in shades of rose and gold. His left sleeve hung empty, pinned at the elbow in the way Caroline had taught him: neat, unobtrusive, matter-of-fact. 3 months had passed since the accident. 3 months of learning to navigate a world that suddenly required twice the thought for half the tasks. "You're up early," Caroline said from the bed they now shared. That particular threshold had been crossed 6 weeks ago, tentatively at first, Then, with growing certainty that what existed between them had evolved beyond convenience into something neither had expected, but both had learned to trust. Couldn't sleep. Hayes wants to check the arm today, make sure everything's healing. Properly. Frank flexed his remaining hand, a habit he'd developed whenever anxiety crept in. And I keep thinking about the meeting with Maggie. Today was the day they'd discuss Frank's future at the Golden Horn. He'd been on medical leave since the accident, surviving on Maggie's charity and Caroline's reduced wages. But charity had limits, and Frank's ability to return to bartending remained questionable. One-handed drink service was possible, Caroline had proven that, but the physical demands of the job extended far beyond pouring whiskey. Caroline rose, moving to stand beside him. In the months since the accident, they developed an unspoken language of mutual support, each understanding the other's struggles with disability in ways that words couldn't quite capture. Whatever Maggie says, we'll figure it out. We always do we? Frank's voice held the edge of despair that still surfaced some mornings, the darkness that Hayes had warned would come and go like weather. Caroline, I can't lift barrels, can't haul ice, can't break up fights, or carry supplies, or do a dozen other things that made me useful. What exactly am I figuring out except new ways to be inadequate? She took his remaining hand, pulling him gently away from the window. You're doing what I did, confusing what you've lost with who you are. Frank, you were never just useful hands. You were the man who remembered everyone's drink preferences, who listened to problems without judgment, who made the Golden Horn feel safe for people who needed safety. That doesn't pay bills or feed children. Neither did my bookkeeping at first, but we found a way to make it matter. Caroline's voice grew firmer. You taught me something these past months, watching you learn to button shirts one-handed and tie your boots and cut your food. You taught me that adaptation isn't surrender. Every time you solve a problem that used to be automatic, you're proving that loss doesn't equal limitation. It just means finding different methods. Frank pulled her close, resting his shin on her head. This physical ease between them still felt miraculous, this comfort in another person's presence that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with recognition. They were mirrors for each other, reflecting back both the damage and the resilience. When did you become so wise? He murmured. Somewhere between losing an arm and gaining a family. I didn't think I deserved. She tilted her head back to meet his eyes. Now get dressed. James is making breakfast, which means we need to intervene before he burns the building down. Downstairs, they found James indeed wrestling with the kitchen stove, his face flushed with concentration as he attempted to flip flapjacks with more enthusiasm than skill. Thomas sat at the table, offering dubious commentary on his brother's culinary technique. You're supposed to wait until there's bubbles, James. That's what Mama said. There are bubbles. See? James gestured with the spatula, sending a half-cooked flapjack sailing across the kitchen. I see a mess is what I see, Caroline said, but her voice held affection rather than criticism. Let me help. Together, mother and son salvaged breakfast, their one-handed and two-handed methods complementing each other in ways that had become routine. Frank watched them work, struck by how seamlessly James had adapted to being Caroline's assistant in tasks that required bilateral coordination. The boy who'd once carried such crushing guilt had channeled it into usefulness, becoming his mother's second pair of hands with patience that belied his years. Thomas, fully recovered from his near-fatal pneumonia, had blossomed in the stability of the past months. The fearful, clinging child had given way to a curious 8-year-old who asked endless questions and drew elaborate pictures of the mountains surrounding their town. He'd taken to following Frank around when not in school, narrating stories and observations with the unself-conscious ease of childhood. Mr. Frank, when your arm grows back, will it be the same one or a different one? Thomas asked over breakfast, the question delivered with such genuine curiosity that no one quite knew how to respond. "Arms don't grow back, stupid," James said, but without real heat. "Thomas isn't stupid for asking," Frank corrected gently. "But James is right. Once an arm's gone, it's gone for good. That's just how bodies work." "That's sad." Thomas considered this seriously. "But at least you and Mama match now, like a set." The innocent observation made Caroline laugh, genuine, unguarded laughter that had become more frequent as the winter's darkness receded. "I suppose we do, don't we? Maybe that makes us official." After breakfast, Frank made his way to the Golden Horn's main room, where Maggie waited, account books spread before her. The older woman's expression was difficult to read, and Frank felt his stomach clench with anticipation of bad news. "Sit down, Frank. We need to have a conversation about the future." Frank sat, his remaining hand resting on the table, in unconscious preparation for rejection. "I know I can't do everything I used to, Maggie, but I can learn to manage with one arm. Caroline's proven it's possible, and Frank," Maggie's voice stopped his desperate pitch, "I'm not dismissing you. I'm promoting you." The words took a moment to register. "What?" "The saloon needs a manager, someone to handle operations while I focus on expansion. I'm planning to open a restaurant next door, actual dining room, not just bar food. Caroline's bookkeeping showed me we've got the capital if we're smart about it." Maggie leaned forward, her expression intent. "You've got the mind for management, Frank. Always have. You understand people, logistics, how to make a business run smooth. That doesn't require two arms, it requires thinking, which last I checked, you've still got a brain for." Frank stared at her, hardly daring to believe. "Management pays? Same as you were making, maybe more once the restaurant's profitable. Caroline would run the books for both establishments. I'm offering her full-time wages again. Between the two of you, we're looking at stable income and actual prospects." Maggie's smile was wry. "Figure it's the least I can do for a man who gave his arm saving a child. Plus, selfishly, I need people I trust, and trust is in shorter supply than gold in this territory." The relief that flooded through Frank was physical, loosening muscles he hadn't realized were clenched. "Maggie, I don't know what to say. Say you'll take the job. Say you'll help me turn this saloon into something more than just a place to drink away hard days. Say you'll prove to this town that disability doesn't mean inability." She pushed the account books toward him. "What do you say, Frank?" "I say yes, yes to all of it." The news transformed their household's prospects overnight. Frank threw himself into learning the management side of the business with the same determination he'd applied to relearning basic tasks. Inventory management, supplier negotiations, staff scheduling, conflict resolution, all required mental acuity rather than physical labor. He discovered talents he hadn't fully utilized as a bartender, found satisfaction in solving logistical puzzles and optimizing operations. Caroline, freed from the fear of poverty that had haunted her since losing the farm, began to breathe easier. Her bookkeeping expanded to encompass Maggie's growing business empire, and she proved invaluable in planning the restaurant's finances. Together, she and Frank became Maggie's most trusted partners, their complementary skills and shared understanding of adaptation making them formidable. But the transformation extended beyond mere employment. The town that had once whispered about them now pointed to them as proof that misfortune didn't dictate destiny. Copper Ridge had seen plenty of tragedy, war widows, mining accidents, diseases that claimed lives with brutal efficiency. What made the Mercers different was their refusal to let loss define limitation. "You two have become something of an inspiration," Dr. Hayes told them one evening at the saloon. "Had a patient yesterday, miner, who lost 3 fingers in a blast. He was ready to give up, said he couldn't work anymore. I brought him here, showed him you two running this place with 1 arm each, told him disability is what you make of it." "We're not heroes," Caroline protested. "We're just doing what we have to do." That's exactly what makes you inspirational. You're proving that ordinary people can survive extraordinary hardship and build meaningful lives. Hayes raised his glass. To ordinary heroes, then, may the rest of us learn from your example. The summer brought Vernon Fletcher back to Copper Ridge one final time, though not in triumph. He appeared at the Golden Horn on a humid August afternoon, his expensive clothes showing signs of wear, his earlier arrogance replaced by something harder and more desperate. "I need money," he said without preamble when Frank agreed to speak with him in Maggie's office. "Business ventures went bad. I'm broke, and I thought perhaps family obligations." "You're asking me for money?" Frank's voice was carefully neutral. "After trying to take my wife's children, after provoking the incident that cost me my arm? That was business, nothing personal, and surely you've profited from it. Got yourself a wife and instant family out of the deal, maybe even got sympathy that helped with your situation." Vernon gestured at Frank's missing arm. "I'm just asking for a small loan. Family helping family. We're not family, Vernon. And even if we were, I don't loan money to men who mistake cruelty for strategy." Frank stood, using his remaining hand to open the office door. "You have no claim on the boys, no right to their inheritance, and no place in our lives. I suggest you leave Copper Ridge and don't return." Vernon left with bitter curses, but his words held no power now. The Fletcher boys were Mercer boys legally and in every way that mattered. James had begun tentatively calling Frank Pa when he thought no one else was listening. Thomas drew pictures of their family that always included 4 figures, 2 of them carefully depicted with only one arm each. September brought the Harvest Festival, and with it, a moment that crystallized everything the past year had built. The town gathered in the square for music and dancing, the air thick with the scent of roasted corn and apple cider. Frank stood with Caroline, watching James and Thomas race through the crowd with other children, their laughter carrying on the wind. "A year ago, I was in an alley begging for scraps," Caroline said softly. "I couldn't have imagined this, any of this. A year ago, I was polishing glasses and pretending I was living instead of just hiding." Frank's arm, his remaining arm, went around her waist. "Strange how the worst things can lead to the best things if you're willing to take the risk. Do you ever regret it? Helping me that day, marrying me, losing your arm for James?" The question held vulnerability that still surfaced sometimes, the lingering fear that she'd ruined his life rather than enriched it. Frank turned her to face him, his hand cupping her cheek with the tenderness that had grown between them like something organic and inevitable. "I regret nothing. Not the pain, not the loss, not the struggle. Because all of it led here to you, to the boys, to a life that actually means something. Even with one arm? Especially with one arm. Because now I understand what you tried to tell me that first night after the accident, that worth isn't measured in physical completeness. It's measured in what you do with what you have, how you love with what remains, how you build when everything says you should quit." He kissed her softly. "We're whole, Caroline. Maybe not in the way we used to be, but whole nonetheless." The music swelled, and someone called for couples to dance. Frank hesitated. Dancing had been difficult enough with 2 arms, and one-arm dancing seemed impossible, but Caroline pulled him toward the cleared space where other couples were gathering. "I can't dance like this," he protested. "Neither can I. So we'll invent our own way, just like we've invented our own way for everything else." Her smile was radiant. "Trust me, Frank, we've earned the right to dance however we want." They moved together awkwardly at first, figuring out balance and rhythm without the symmetry most couples took for granted. But gradually they found their method. Caroline's hand in Frank's, his arm around her waist, her shoulder against his chest where his missing arm would have rested. They swayed more than danced, but there was grace in it. Nonetheless, the grace of 2 people who'd learned that perfection was overrated and adaptation was its own kind of beauty. James and Thomas watched from the sidelines, and Frank caught James's expression pride mixed with wonder, as if seeing his mother and stepfather dance had proven something the boy needed confirmed. That happiness was possible, that loss didn't preclude joy, that families could be built from broken pieces and become stronger for the breaking. As autumn deepened toward winter again, the Mercer household settled into rhythms that felt permanent rather than temporary. Frank's management of the Golden Horn proved so successful that Maggie made him a partner in the business, giving him a stake in its continued prosperity. Caroline's accounting reputation spread beyond the saloon, bringing in additional clients who paid for her meticulous bookkeeping. James, now 10, had grown into his role as oldest son with increasing confidence. He helped Frank with tasks that required two hands, not out of guilt anymore, but out of genuine desire to contribute. Thomas thrived in school, his natural curiosity channeled into learning that Martha Dennison encouraged with special attention. On a cold December evening, exactly 1 year after Vernon's first appearance in Copper Ridge, the family gathered in their room above the saloon. Frank had built a fire in the stove, a task that had taken weeks to master one-handed, but now came easily. Caroline was mending James's coat, the needle and thread moving with practiced efficiency despite her single hand. The boys were absorbed in a checker game, their rivalry friendly rather than fierce. "I've been thinking," Frank said into the comfortable quiet, "about legacy, about what we want to leave behind when we're gone." Caroline looked up from her mending. "That's rather morbid for a pleasant evening. Not morbid, practical. We've built something here, something worth protecting and passing on. I want to make sure the boys are provided for, that they understand what we've tried to teach them about resilience and adaptation." Frank's expression grew serious. "But more than that, I want them to know they saved us as much as we saved them." James looked up from the checkerboard. "What do you mean?" "I mean that before you and Thomas and your mother came into my life, I was existing but not living, going through motions but not really feeling anything. You three woke me up, reminded me that being alive means being willing to risk, to feel, to lose, to love." Frank's voice roughened slightly. "You gave me purpose, James, and that's worth more than any arm." The boy's eyes shone with unshed tears. "You really think of us as yours? Not just Mama's children you got stuck with? James, I think of you as the son of my heart, if not my blood. Both of you." Frank looked at Thomas, who had abandoned the checkers to listen intently. "Blood makes you related, but love makes you family. And I love you both more than I ever imagined I could love anyone." Thomas launched himself at Frank with the uncomplicated affection of childhood, wrapping his arms around his stepfather's neck. James moved more slowly, but when he reached them, his embrace was just as fierce. Caroline watched them, her mending forgotten, tears streaming freely down her face. "We're so lucky," she whispered, "to have found each other, to have survived everything that tried to break us, to have built this." That night, after the boys were asleep and Frank and Caroline lay together in the darkness, she spoke the words that had been building for months. "I love you, Frank Mercer. Not because you saved us, not because you gave us stability, but because of who you are, kind and strong and brave in ways that have nothing to do with physical strength. I love you, and I thank God every day that you were foolish enough to help a beggar woman in an alley." Frank pulled her closer, his heart full to bursting. "I love you too. Have loved you since that first week when you reorganized Maggie's entire inventory system with one hand and sheer determination. I just didn't recognize it yet because I'd forgotten what love felt like. And now I remember. Now I know. Now I understand that the best things in life come from the moments when you're brave enough to choose connection over safety." He kissed her softly. Thank you for choosing me, even when I came with nothing but complications. Thank you for choosing us, even when we came with everything broken. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, blanketing Copper Ridge in white that would melt and return a dozen times before spring. But inside the room, above the Golden Horn, a family slept peacefully. A one-armed bartender who'd become a manager, a one-armed widow who'd become a businesswoman, and two boys who'd found a father in the man, brave enough to sacrifice everything to save them. They were scarred but whole, damaged but functional, broken but beautiful in their brokenness. They were proof that loss doesn't have to mean limitation, that disability doesn't dictate destiny, and that love, real love, grows strongest in the cracks where hardship tried to break us. The next morning would bring new challenges, as all mornings do. But the Mercers had learned something essential about survival, that the only way forward is together, one day at a time, one task at a time, accepting help when needed and offering it when possible. They had learned that redemption isn't a destination but a practice, that healing isn't linear but worthwhile, and that family isn't defined by blood or perfection, but by the stubborn choice to keep showing up for each other no matter what. In the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.